Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Einstein Syndrome, Bright Children Who Talk Late, by Thomas Sowell, narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Preface. This book is about a very special set of children who have seldom been studied before. Children who are exceptionally bright and also exceptionally slow to develop the ability to speak. The first study of a group of such children was my book, Late Talking Children, published in 1997. That book was primarily about a group of 46 youngsters whose parents formed a network across the country. This book is not primarily about that group, but incorporates new information from scientific studies, as well as new personal histories and data from a subsequent study of a new group of 239 children, like those in my group by Professor Stephen M. Camarata, a speech-language pathologist at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The Einstein Syndrome also draws upon many personal histories of people who were not part of either group. While some people saw late-talking children as simply anecdotal evidence about individuals, the Einstein Syndrome begins by focusing in the first chapter on hard statistical data about the highly unusual individual and family patterns found in both my group and Professor Camarata's group. Against that background, subsequent discussions of individual histories can be seen as confirmations and examples of those patterns, rather than as mere isolated anecdotes. Moreover, most of these histories are about different people than those covered in the first book. Once the patterns have been established, both from statistics and from histories of flesh and blood people, the next step is to seek some explanation of these highly unusual patterns. That is attempted in Chapter 4, Groping for Answers. Chapter 5 then goes into the painful dilemmas involved in evaluations of these children, and Chapter 6 considers the pros and cons of putting a particular child in a particular early intervention program. Finally, Chapter 7 deals with what parents can do to cope with the uncertainties that remain, even after our best efforts to determine why this set of bright children talk late, and deals with the even more difficult questions as to why a particular parent's particular child talks late. Some afterthoughts about the further implications of this study are expressed in the epilogue. There are no easy answers or magic formulas, yet there is enough solid information to enable parents to resist those who claim to have easy answers or magic formulas. For many parents, the most serious problem with their late-talking child does not come from the speech delay as such, but from the fears surrounding what that delay might mean for the future and from the reactions of other adults to that delay. Relatives, neighbors, teachers, daycare center workers, and others have often inflicted much needless anxiety and anguish on parents with thoughtless remarks and reckless attempts at diagnosis. Mothers are especially likely to be blamed for the child's speech delay, even when the same parents have raised other children who talked at the normal time or even earlier than usual. Perhaps, worst of all, there are people who exploit parental fears to try to steer their children into programs that may not be right for the particular child. There are so many wholly different reasons why children talk late that there can be no one-size-fits-all explanation or treatment. Deafness, mental retardation, autism, and physical problems with ears, tongue, or palate are all possibilities. So is the special set of characteristics discussed in this book and called the Einstein Syndrome, where none of these disabilities is present, but where the child follows a special development pattern found in a number of both famous and unknown people, including, of course, Albert Einstein. No responsible parents are likely to simply assume that their particular late-talking child has the Einstein Syndrome without having had physicians and others test for and rule out more dire possibilities. If anything, parents are more likely to continue to worry, even after repeated tests turn up nothing wrong, while the child shows every sign of being very bright and exhibits all the other characteristics discussed in this book. In addition to their natural concerns and apprehensions, parents may be subjected to pressure from others to do something. These may be relatives, friends, neighbors, or people promoting various programs in schools or elsewhere. But if qualified medical and other highly trained specialists say to let the child develop in his or her own way, then that may be the something that should be done. For other children, perhaps most children who talk late, early intervention may be the way to go. Children with the characteristics discussed in this book are probably a minority among those who talk late. Most parents of the kinds of children discussed here have never seen another child like their own. Letters that poured into me after I first publicly discussed this subject often expressed a great sense of relief just to know that there was another child somewhere with the same set of characteristics as theirs. Yet such children are not quite as rare as they may seem. Overall, I have heard from the parents of well over 100 such children. Parents who know of no other child like their own may nevertheless know some adult who went through the same stages as a child. Such adults seldom talk about such things, and many are themselves wholly unaware of having gone through such stages as small children. 2 friends of mine discovered that they had been late talkers only after they mentioned my study to their mothers. My college roommate knew that he had talked late, but I learned about it only years after we had both graduated. In short, while children with the characteristics described in this book are rare, they are not quite so rare as they might seem to their parents. Thomas Sowell, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Chapter 1. Patterns, Family and Child. Many parents of late talkers get advice on how to fix things, and many of them have a lot of guilt. But I rarely encounter parents who are actually in any way responsible for the late talking. Professor Stephen Camarata, Vanderbilt University Medical Center. This book is about very bright children who are unusually late, sometimes years behind schedule, in beginning to talk. Most bright children are not late in talking, and most children who are late in talking are not exceptionally bright. But there is a special set of youngsters with a distinctive set of characteristics, and whose families also have a distinctive set of characteristics, whose speech development lags far behind that of other children their age, while their intellectual development surges ahead of that of their peers. The most famous such person was Albert Einstein, but there have been many others. In a world where there are norms set for when infants are supposed to do everything, sit up, crawl, walk, talk, many parents nervously compare when their own child does these things with when they are supposed to do them, according to the charts, books, and magazines. Where these parents are in contact with other parents whose children are the same age, their anxieties may be magnified if little Johnny is not doing things as early as a neighbor's little Susie. In the end, nearly all people walk, talk, learn to use the bathroom, and read and write. In later life, no one is ever likely to know or care when they first did any of these things. But, of course, parents of small children are rightly focused very anxiously on the present as a young life unfolds before their eyes. No doubt norms can be useful to parents, physicians, and others who deal with small children, and who must be on the lookout for problems and dangers. In some cases, however, these norms may do more harm than good. Norms are based on averages, and there is often much variation around those averages. Norms can hang like a dark cloud over those parents whose children pass their 2nd, 3rd, or even 4th birthday without speaking. Tragic as this may be when the child is retarded or deaf, parents eventually come to terms with this. But those parents who are most likely to be continually torn with contradictory feelings and to hear conflicting conclusions from others, including experts, are those whose children show every sign of being bright, often strikingly brighter in some ways than other children their age, and yet who remain silent, while the children of neighbors and friends develop the ability to speak at the normal time. I am the father of such a child, and 4 years ago I published the first study of such children. My son, incidentally, is today a computer software engineer. There were many studies of late-talking children in general before mine, but none focusing on very bright children who are years behind schedule in speaking. While it was known that Einstein was such a child, there was little or no awareness of how many other very bright people were also years late in talking. Indeed, I was continually surprised to discover how many such people there were, in all walks of life, famous and unknown. Many parents who read my book, Late Talking Children, wrote to me to say that they were astonished to read about things that seemed like an eyewitness description of their own child and their own family. One mother said that she got goosebumps reading descriptions that fit her child and her family so closely, while other mothers have reported simply weeping as they read for the first time something that so obviously fitted their own puzzling child. The number of such children whose parents wrote to me after the book was published far exceeded the 46 children covered in that book. Now, 4 years later, it is possible not only to follow the progress of that original set of children, but also to draw upon new research on an even larger sample of other bright children who talked late by Professor Stephen Camarata of the Vanderbilt University Medical School. In addition to being a psychologist specializing in childhood language disorders and the author of articles on the subject, Professor Camarata is also the father of a late-talking child, and he himself was 3.5 years old before he began to speak. Before setting forth the patterns found in both our studies and the further development of the children in the original group that was studied, it is necessary to warn parents that not all children who talk late are like the children in these studies. False hope can be as cruel as unnecessary despair. Children can talk late for a wide variety of reasons. Some have physical defects in their ears or their tongues or elsewhere. Some are autistic. Their mental levels range from severely retarded on up to the level of late talkers who have grown up and gone on to win Nobel Prizes in economics and in physics. Many studies of late-talking children compare this entire highly heterogeneous group with normal children and find that, on average, late talkers are usually somewhat behind in intellectual skills and often have other lasting problems. Yet, when these studies break down this very disparate group into 1. Those who neither speak nor understand what is said to them, and 2. Those who clearly understand but just do not talk, the latter typically does much better and are more likely to develop normally. My study and that of Professor Camarata are the first to focus more narrowly on late-talking children who are not merely normal in intelligence but above normal. Although there were no studies of such children just 5 years ago, now there are 2, and the 2 groups of children and their families can be compared. What do we now know about such children and their families? Family patterns. The families in both studies of bright children who talk late are very atypical. The great majority of these children have close relatives in highly analytical occupations, such as engineers, scientists, and mathematicians. The typical child in these 2 samples also has multiple close relatives who play a musical instrument, some as professional musicians. This is not just a matter of an engineer here or a musician there. Usually the same child has a number of close relatives in these categories. The median number in my study was 4, and the range was from 1 child with none to 3 children with 9 such close relatives each. This is all the more remarkable because the term close relatives was used very narrowly in my study to include only parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts. It did not include even first cousins. Professor Camarata's study used a similarly restricted definition of close relatives, except that his study included siblings, which my study neglected to do. The general patterns found among the 43 biological families in my study were quite similar to those found in the 232 biological families who joined Professor Camarata's group during its first 2 years. My group was originally formed for mutual support, rather than research, and had grown to 55 families by the time I sent out the survey whose results were presented in Late Talking Children. Of these 55 families, 44 filled out the questionnaires that I sent them, and these 44 families contained 46 late-talking children, since 2 families had 2 late talkers each. Because one child was adopted and his biological family was unknown, there were 43 biological families in my study. In Professor Camarata's study, there were 235 families, of whom 232 were biological families, since 2 families had adopted a child who talked late, and 1 family had such a child born as a result of being fathered by an unknown sperm donor. Altogether, there were 239 children in his group at the end of 2 years, of whom 236 were biological children of their respective families. Professor Camarata's group was not only much larger, but also grew faster and continued growing after membership in my group was closed. In June 2000, he was generous enough to provide me with data on the families who had joined during the first 2 years of his research. This allows the patterns found in the 2 studies to be compared, as regards both individuals and families. Analytical occupations. The most striking thing about the families in both groups are their highly atypical and highly analytical occupations. 74% of the biological children in my study and 70% of the biological children in the study conducted by Professor Camarata had at least one close relative who was either an engineer, a scientist, or a mathematician. Engineers alone were close relatives of 60% of the children in my group and 59% of the children in Camarata's group. Other occupations requiring highly analytical education were also heavily represented among the close relatives of the children in both the groups. The table shows the respective percentages of the biological children who had close relatives in the following occupations. Accountants. Original study, 53%. Camarata study, 38%. Computer specialists. Original study, 35%. Camarata study, 44%. Engineers. Original study, 60%. Camarata study, 59%. Mathematicians. Original study, 5%. Camarata study, 17%. Physicians. Original study, 12%. Camarata study, 19%. Pilots. Original study, 14%. Camarata study, 13%. Scientists. Original study, 20%. Camarata study, 18%. Other analytical occupations. Original study, 5%. Camarata study, 20%. At least one of the above. Original study, 86%. Camarata study, 89%. 2 or more of the above. Original study, 65%. Camarata study, 70%. How unusual are these families? Ideally, we would like to compare them with families of the same size, age, and socioeconomic circumstances in the general population, but that is neither feasible nor necessary. We know that 3/5 of the children in the general population cannot have engineers as close relatives, simply because there are not nearly enough engineers in the country for that to be true. Similarly with people in other analytical occupations. These are highly unusual families that the late-talking children in both our groups come from. When all the close relatives in highly analytical occupations are counted, the families in both these groups are clearly skewed in the direction of unusual mathematical and other analytical abilities. Such a high incidence of close family members in highly analytical occupations is unusual, not only as compared to the population at large, but also as compared to late-talking children in general. A study in England of late-talking children in general found that only 2% of the fathers of these British children with language delays were engineers. By contrast, 20% of the children in my group and 22% of the children in Camarata's group have fathers who are engineers. Children with the Einstein Syndrome are not just late talkers. They and their families have a whole set of other atypical characteristics, as will become clearer as the data are examined. Such high concentrations of engineers in these families would be remarkable enough if engineering were the only highly analytical occupation among the relatives of these children. But when other professions such as mathematician, scientist, computer specialist, pilot, economist, and accountants are added, then 37 of the 43 biological families in my group have at least one close relative of the child in such fields, and most have more than one. The same general pattern was found in Stephen Camarata's group, where 210 out of 232 biological families have at least one close relative of the child in these analytical occupations. Music. 3/4 of the biological children in my group had at least one close relative who played a musical instrument. That includes 57% who had multiple musicians among their close relatives. Among parents alone, at least one parent played a musical instrument in just over half of the families. Professional musicians were close relatives of 26% of the biological children in my group. In Camarata's group, 78% of the biological children had at least one close relative who played a musical instrument, and 66% had multiple musicians among close relatives. 28% of the biological children in his group had a professional musician among their close relatives. Again, these are highly unusual proportions of people who play musical instruments, especially at the professional level, and lends further support to the picture of people with unusual, and probably hereditary, kinds of specialized abilities. When analytical and musical occupations are considered together, only 3 of the 43 biological families in my group failed to have a close relative of the late-talking child in one of these fields. Most had multiple members in such fields. In Camarata's group, only 4% of the families, 12 out of 232, were without a close relative of the child in any of these analytical occupations and without a close relative who played a musical instrument. That is not very different from the 7% in my study. More than 9 out of 10 of the biological children in his group, 91%, had 2 or more close relatives in either of these categories, and more than 4 out of 5, 83%, had 3 or more close relatives in these categories. Educational levels. The parents of the children in both groups are above average in education. Nearly 3 out of 5, 59%, of the parents in my group had completed at least 4 years of college, including 27% who had postgraduate education. In Camarata's group, 71% of the parents had 4 years of college, including 26% who had postgraduate education. Since many financial and social conditions are involved in getting a higher education, this is not as strong evidence of unusual hereditary mental abilities as the data on analytical occupations and musicians. However, it is consistent with the other indications of atypical families. Late talking relatives. Were there other late talkers among the close relatives of the children studied? In my group, 26% of the children had a close relative who talked late, and in Camarata's group, 48% of the children had a close relative who talked late. However, the majority of parents in both groups, and among many others outside these groups whom I have heard from, have no other child like their own among their close relatives. Many parents said that they had never seen or heard of a child like theirs. That has contributed to a great sense of utter isolation and bafflement often expressed by parents of very bright children who talk late. Those parents who did report having another late talker among their relatives, especially when these other late talkers had turned out fine, often reported that this gave them hope, even when experts made dire predictions about their children. Patterns among the children. What patterns did we find among the children themselves? The children in both studies differ from children in general in sex ratios, ability patterns, and social characteristics. Since we are now considering individuals rather than families, here we count all the children, 46 in my group and 239 in Professor Camarata's group, regardless of whether they are or are not the biological children. Sex ratios. The overwhelming majority of the late-talking children in my group and in Professor Camarata's group are boys. 87% of the children in my group of 55 late-talking children, which began forming in 1993, were boys. Among the 46 children surveyed, 89% were boys. In Professor Camarata's group of 236 biological children, 85% were boys, with the same percentage being boys among the total of 239 children in his sample. Yet those relatively few late talkers in our groups who are girls share the same individual and family patterns as the boys. For example, 5 of the 7 girls in my group had at least one engineer as a close relative, and 5 of the 7 also had at least one close relative who played a musical instrument. All of these were biological children. In Camarata's group, 24 of the 36 girls who were biological children had an engineer as a close relative, and 31 of these 36 girls had at least one relative who played a musical instrument. In terms of their own behavior, the girls in both groups are so similar to boys that, with one exception, their data are not listed separately here. For example, 75% of the girls and 77% of the boys in Professor Camarata's group like building things. This question was not covered in my survey. Mental abilities. The children in both studies show the same skew in the direction of highly analytical abilities that their relatives show. While still toddlers, most excel in putting puzzles together, sometimes including puzzles designed for older children or adults. Poetry, art, or social skills seldom figure prominently among their interests or achievements, either as children or adults. Surprisingly, few of the children in either study had been given formal intelligence tests, despite their delay in speech development. Perhaps this was because the parents had seen enough signs of their precocious mental abilities to have no serious doubts on that score. Indeed, it was often the contrast between their intellectual progress and their delayed speech that proved so baffling to parents and professionals alike. In both studies, parents were asked to rate their children's abilities in solving puzzles as average, below average, or unusually good. Here are the breakdowns for both groups. Unusually good. Original study, 67%. Camarata study, 46%. Average. Original study, 15%. Camarata study, 37%. Below average. Original study, 11%. Camarata study, 8%. Not noticed. Original study, 7%. Camarata study, 7%. While the children in Camarata's group were not as heavily concentrated in the top category, that was still the category with the most children, and just 8% were rated below average on puzzles, compared to 11% in my group. Nor can these ratings be dismissed as optimistic parental bias, for only a minority of these same parents rated their children above average on physical skills, 35% in my study and 37% in Camarata's study, and in both groups an absolute majority of the parents rated their children below average or far below average in social development. Memory is another aspect of mental ability. Here again, the most common rating in both studies was the highest rating. Extremely good. Original study, 59%. Camarata study, 52%. Above average. Original study, 42%. Camarata study, 33%. Average. Original study, none. Camarata study, 13%. Below average. Original study, none. Camarata study, 1%. very poor. Original study, none. Camarata study, 7%.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?